environmental approvals in India, even today, are matters of fait accompli. They put up a project and they will come to government and say, oh, we forgot to get this clearance, but we've already invested 5,000 crores. We're already employing 1,000 people, 800 people, you know. So give us the clearance. So this was the mentality over a period of time. This is, you know Hindi? This baad mein dekha jayega was the approach to environmental approvals.
Welcome to Mongabay Sessions. I am your host, Gopi Krishna Warrior, Managing Editor of Mongabay India. In this series, we will be interviewing leading conservation players in India on their experiences and their ideas to make the world a better place. I have with me Mr. Jairam Ramesh, India's former Environment Minister and currently a Member of Parliament. Mr. Ramesh is an engineer and an economist and worked with the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh. Later, when Dr. Singh became the Prime Minister, Mr. Ramesh was the Environment Minister from 2009 to 2011. He is currently the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Science, Technology and Environment. A prolific writer, Mr. Ramesh authors a book almost every year, and currently the latest one is called The Light of Asia. He's done two books on environment, one, his memoirs from the Ministry of Environment and Forests called Green Signals, and the other one called Life in Nature, a biography of, environmental biography of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Welcome to Mongabay Sessions, Mr. Ramesh. Such a pleasure to have you with us. Mr. Ramesh, I don't know whether you would remember nearly 30 years ago in 1993, when the Hindu Business Line newspaper was starting, you had a session for the journalists, young journalists who had been recruited for the newspaper, which included me at that point of time. I was a young reporter with Hindu Business Line. And you were talking to us about economic reforms. You were gung ho about economic reforms and upbeat about economic reforms, and you hardly talked about environment at that time. So, what happened? Was it a change of heart, or as an economist, you saw the economic value of conserving environment?
No, absolutely. I mean, it was a complete accident. It was a, hand of destiny. In 2009, when I was made environment minister. In 2006, I became an MP in 2004. In early 2006, I became the Minister of State for Commerce. Then I was given additional responsibility for power in 2008. So that was my career trajectory, economics, infrastructure. And when the Congress party came back to power in 2009, I expected one of the economic ministries, which is what I had been working on, and for 30 years, 25 years. So it was completely out of the blue that the Prime Minister and the chairperson of the UPA, Mrs. Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi, offered me, the ministership of environment and forests. And initially, I was taken aback. Initially, I was a bit reluctant. I told the Prime Minister, "Sir, this is not my cup of tea. I mean, I'm not an environmentalist, and I'm not known to be an environmentalist. And all my, since the mid '80s, I've been working on economic issues. I worked on international trade, I worked on industry, I worked on energy. Mostly." The Prime Minister laughed and he said, "No, no, no, you must go, because climate change negotiations are going to be very crucial for India. And you have a background in the economy, you have a background in energy, and I'm sure that you'll, establish yourself in the environment ministry." So the first 1 or 2 days, I was a bit, you know, uh, I've written about it, in my book Green Signals. That initially, couple of days, I was a little like a fish out of water. I had environmentalist friends. I was I was part of the network. I mean, I knew a lot of people. I was closely associated, for example, with the Center for Science and Environment and various other organizations. But to be Minister of Environment and Forests was a completely different proposition. So the first few days, I was feeling my way around, but very soon I settled down. And, I've held other portfolios after that. But even today, in 2021, when I go to different parts of India, uh, I am introduced. Some people mistake me still as the continuing Minister for Environment, and I'm always introduced as former Minister of Environment. Although I've done other things in my life, rural development, drinking water, the other economic ministries. And even abroad, I mean, whenever I go, people just refer to me as, India's former Minister for Environment. So it's something that this is a post 2009 phenomenon. This avatar. I look upon it as an avatar. I did not have this eco avatara in before 2009. This avatar came only after 2009. And long after I left the environment ministry, people would continue, to write to me, call me to speak. And of course, 2 years ago, I became chairman of the Standing Committee on Environment and Forests and Climate Change. And even in Parliament, people, whenever the issue of environment or climate comes up, even if I have not given my name, the chairman asks me to speak. So it's sort of I've got branded, so to speak.
Yeah, actually, you were the environment minister only for 25 months, actually, which is a uh, rather small period. I mean, there have been ministers who have had far longer stints, but you managed to attract attention to yourself and also to the ministry while you were there. Do
26,
you
26 to be precise, because every month counted in that ministry. So it was 26 months actually.
I stand corrected. Did you? And it was actually, I mean, a very interesting period at that time, 2009 to 2011. That's the time when India was going through some kind of a sense of economic renaissance. I mean, there was globally there was a recession, but we sort of came out of it uh, in good shape. And also, that's the time when the big climate change meeting was happening in Copenhagen, which the world had so much of faith in Copenhagen. So, do you feel that you were the, I mean, maybe reluctant, but you were the right person at the right time during the ministry?
Well, there were two dimensions to this job. One was the international dimension, which was the repositioning of India in global climate change negotiations. And the other one was the domestic dimension, which was the enforcement of laws, and to make sure that the laws and the regulations that we have for the protection of the environment are enforced. Um, when I met the Prime Minister before I, took over formally, when I called on him, and this was on the 31st of May, 2009, he actually, said the first thing he told me was, as I mentioned to you, that India needs to be a much more constructive and much more proactive player in global climate change negotiations. Number one. And number two, he said, look, we need to pay far greater attention to the environment, in industry, in transport, and various other sectors. I mean, that's all he told me. So I saw these as, two interlinked priorities. The international dimension, which is repositioning India from, in the global climate change negotiating forums. And the second, of course, was the domestic dimension, which is to enforce the laws. Now, I became controversial in both. I mean, but I believe that they were closely interrelated. You cannot claim leadership in international forums if your domestic record is does not speak for itself. I mean, for example, one of the criticisms I have of the current government is that they speak in international forums the language of environmental responsibility, but domestically, the actions are not giving the signal of environmental responsibility in any way. So I think I saw that as my role, and of course, I was, I didn't come as a complete stranger to environment. I mean, I was aware of the environmental issues. I had been associated with people in the environmental field, as I mentioned, Center for Science and Environment, Ashok Khosla, I knew very well. Dr. Pachauri was somebody whom I had worked with for almost 15 years in the energy field. Sundarlal Bahuguna and Chandi Prasad Bhatt. I knew Madhav Gadgil was another person whom I had been in touch with long before I became a minister. So I knew these people. I knew the nature community, I knew the conservation community, but I didn't see myself, as a conservationist or as a champion of nature. I mean, that was, not. I was a champion of economic reforms. I was at that time the champion of opening up the economy. I was a champion of science, technology, but environment was very, very far away, very far away. In fact, my wife was a greater environmentalist than me. I mean, she was far more sensitive, to environmental issues, and my children were far more sensitive to environmental issues, my son, particularly, older son. So I came onto this pretty late. I'm a latecomer. Um, but I saw this as an opportunity, uh, doing the right thing. I mean, as Minister for Environment, my job is not to be the Minister of Environmental Clearances or the Minister of Environmental Approvals. My job is to protect the environment. My job is to, I still remember, in 1983, I still recall, this was, I think, December of 1983, when I was working on my in the energy sector, and I went with my minister, Mr. K.C. Pant, to Kerala, and we met the electricity minister at that point of time. That was Mr. R. Balakrishna Pillai. You know, and Balakrishna Pillai was very, very angry, and he was very angry that Indira Gandhi had stopped the Silent Valley project. She had stopped it in October of 1983. And Mr. Balakrishna Pillai was so angry that he turned to Mr. Pant and he said, "What, Mr. Pant? This Prime Minister, she likes monkeys more than she likes Malayalis." I still remember that phrase that Balakrishna Pillai used, that, she prefers monkeys to Malayalis. So, uh, I knew about Silent Valley. MP Parameshwaran was a very close friend of mine. We had worked on other issues, education issues. So I knew about Silent Valley. I knew about the Chipko movement. But becoming, as I said, coming to the ministry and becoming a minister was a completely different proposition altogether.
Politically, how did you find space for yourself? Because the UPA was itself a bit of a yin and a yang. I mean, you had the prime minister focusing on economic growth, and the Congress president, focusing more on equity-led legislation. So, how did you find political space, or you had no
It
problem
was
with political?
very, very, very difficult. Every day was a battle. I was fighting my own ministerial colleagues. I was fighting my own chief ministers very often. Yeah, it was difficult, but you had to stand up for what you believe, what is right. And my defense was that I am doing nothing but enforcing the laws of the land. I mean, we have the Wildlife Protection Act of 72. We have the Water Pollution Control Act of 1974. We have the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. We have the Air Pollution Control Act of 81. We have the Environmental Protection Act of 86, 1986. And then finally, we had the Forest Rights Act of 2006. So my stand was, look, please tell me where I am going beyond these six laws. Whatever is in the law books, I am enforcing. That's all. That's all I'm doing. I'm not inventing a new law. I am not adding to any new law. I'm not amending any law. Here are the laws passed by Parliament. And I am going by the book. Now, many people were upset with this. Many people, because you see, in India, environmental approvals in India, even today, are matters of fait accompli. They put up a project and they will come to government and say, oh, we forgot to get this clearance, but we've already invested 5,000 crores. We're already employing 1,000 people, 800 people, you know. So give us the clearance. So this was the mentality over a period of time. This is, you know Hindi? This baad mein dekha jayega was the approach to environmental approvals. And remember, there are two approvals. There is an environmental approval under the Environment Protection Act, and there is a forest approval under the Forest Conservation Act. It's not one consolidated approval. You need to get both. So people would get environmental approval and start the project without the forest approval. And then they would say, we've set up a plant. There's a very famous case, the Ruyas, a joint venture between the Ruyas and Kumaramangalam Birla, the Mahan project. They set up a project, they put up a power plant, but they didn't have a coal linkage. They had not got the clearance. Now, how can you do this? So I put a stop to it. There was a famous Lavasa project, which built a whole hill city, never got any clearances. There was the Vedanta project, which got a clearance for 1 million ton and put up 6 million tons. Now, obviously, pollution load from a 6 million ton alumina refinery is going to be significantly different from a 1 million ton alumina refinery. So the attitude of industry was, "Baad mein dekha jayega. We'll handle it when it comes." So it was fait accompli. So I said, no fait accompli. You know, whoever is done, whatever has happened, public sector, private sector, Congress government, BJP government, makes no difference. A law will be enforced, penalties will be imposed, and if a project doesn't have forest clearance, it will not start. Simple as that. Now, big business was upset. Corporate India was upset. I remember the new international airport in Navi Mumbai. It involved loss of hundreds of acres of mangrove forests. It involved blasting a hill. It involved diversion of a river. And I said, no environmental clearance unless these issues are addressed. And the project ultimately got redesigned. But Mr. Sharad Pawar was very upset with me. He was agriculture minister. Mr. Praful Patel was the civil aviation minister. They're very close friends of mine. They're colleagues of mine. I respect them. I work with them. I like them. But what to do? I was given a job. I have to do it. No, my job was not to clear it. My job was to ensure that the international airport subscribed to all the environmental rules and regulations. So, it was a daily fight. A daily fight. I mean, I left home every day at 8:15. I was in my office at 8:20. It's a 5-minute drive from my house. Every day, 8:15, I would leave. 8:20, maximum 8:25, I would leave. I would reach my office. I would leave the office sharp at 8 p.m. So it was a 12-hour day. And I can tell you, in that 12-hour day, it was 12-hour a day, 6 days a week. Sunday was the only day I never went to work, but I worked out of the house. But 75 to 80% of the time was political negotiations, creating this political space. And for every bouquet I got, I would get a brickbat. you know. and the same people who would give me bouquets in the morning would give me brickbats in the evening. I'll give you an example. When I issued some show cause notice to some hydel projects which had not fulfilled their environmental conditions. The Meda Patkars and the Sunita Narayans and all the great environmentalists hailed me, welcomed my decision. But that same evening or a day later, I gave the environmental clearance, a conditional environmental clearance, to the Jaitapur nuclear power plant. And the same environmentalists went after me, saying that, how can you give this environmental clearance? See, the point I'm making is that the environmentalists were not happy that I was not progressive enough, bold enough. The industrialists and the economists were very unhappy that I was enforcing the law. So the net result at the end of 26 months was that I pleased nobody. I mean, take the Mullai Periyar issue, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah.
The Mullai Periyar issue, all I did was to give, the clearance for, environmental for a forest survey. And my effigies were burnt in Tamil Nadu. When I landed in Chennai airport to see my in-laws, I saw my effigies burning, and the TV channels were going after me. Or during Athirapalli, I remember Mr. A.K. Balan, who was then the power minister of Kerala. He came to meet me, and I said, "No, Mr. Balan." He said, "No, no, I'm not going to do it. And I explained to him, and then the entire CPM guys came down on me. They protested to Mrs. Gandhi. Because they were still, then
Part of the coalition.
well, they were not part of. Technically, they were not part of UPA because
Yeah,
the
yeah.
CPM was not part of UPA too. But still, they supported. I mean, they had good friends. I mean, it was not like UPA won.
Mm, mm.
But so the point is that in this job, a minister of environment who ends up having friends has not done his job, because it is in the nature of the minister of environment to create, to create enemies for himself.
Yeah.
And in my book, I have described this as this is a phrase that Henry Kissinger once used in the context of Balkans. When there was a international efforts to bring peace into erstwhile Yugoslavia, Henry Kissinger said that the solution can only achieve balanced dissatisfaction. It cannot achieve balanced satisfaction. So, environment minister will be successful if you achieve balanced dissatisfaction. But I decided that the only way to meet this situation was to be completely transparent.
Yes.
Completely transparent.
And that's what people sort of recognize you for
I mean,
the kind of.
I said that's the only weapon I have. It's the only weapon I have. I don't have a great political base. I'm not a mass leader. You know, I'm not a Lok Sabha MP. I'm a Rajya Sabha MP. Uh, so you know, the only instrument I have is transparency. So I had glass doors. I all my file notings were made public. All my decision speaking orders were made public. Any meetings I had, it was open. I never held anything back. And I really believe that the instrument that I had was transparency, to open it up. And, there were people who criticized me. Fine, there were decisions that were taken. The National Green Tribunal, for example, long after I left, was critical of my decision to give clearance to some coal mines in Chhattisgarh. But they based their criticism on a speaking order that I had issued, which put into the public domain all the file notings. And I told my officers, look, you don't second guess me. You don't second guess me. Please put down what you believe. So there are many places in the files where I agreed with the officials. There are many places where I disagreed. And where I disagreed, I was open. And I said, look, this is why I have disagreed. And I think that's the speaking orders. And there were, over 20 speaking orders, a large number of speaking orders. All the files were in the public domain. Nothing was held back. So, ultimately, I think if I survived those 26 months, it was because of transparency, nothing else.
Yeah, and I think people on both sides, and people who criticized you and people who praised you and criticized and praised at the same time. I mean, they all sort of appreciate you for the fact that uh, you brought discussions on these issues. The decisions were not taken, uh, you know, abruptly or pushed down people's throats. So that's. But I wanted to ask you about one very specific speaking order on GM Brinjal. The GM discussion, GM controversy had started in mid 1990s, and it had sort of been there, and then it came to you. It came through the court order, but then you at one level you had a moratorium, and at the other level you said research should go on. I mean, which itself was a bit difficult because because of the moratorium, research was unlikely to go on. But more than that, weren't you trying to push the ball? Past the buck, or because the decision had come to you. I mean, you were the last person to have taken the decision, but it didn't. The decision it still is not there.
My
Yes or
decision,
no?
my decision was made public, if I remember, on the 10th of February, 2010. 11 years have passed by, but that decision has not been reversed. 11 years have gone. Successive governments have come. There have been many environment ministers, but nobody has revoked that decision. Now, what was my decision? My decision was that there should be a temporary moratorium. I didn't use the word temporary, I used the word moratorium because a moratorium, by its very nature, is a temporary, it's not a ban. And my view was that, you see, Mr. Warrior, I was a great supporter of BT Cotton. I wrote publicly in favor of BT Cotton. I was publicly supported BT Cotton long before I became environment minister. But when the BT brinjal issue came up, remember it was a food crop. It was the first time we were called upon to decide on the food crop. So that was something that was at the back of my mind. And I found that no public consultation process had gone through. This was, between the GEAC, the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, and the developers, Mahiko. So hardly any, public debate and hardly any public consultation. So I consulted a large number of scientists. I went to Chennai. I spent 4 hours with Dr. Swaminathan, the Bhishma Pitamaha of Indian agricultural research. And I learned a lot from him. I wrote to 50 scientists across the world, including in India. I got responses from them. I found that state governments had not been consulted, and I wrote to all the state governments for their views. And finally, my decision was I didn't kick the ball. I'm sorry, I slightly disagree with you. I didn't kick the ball. I just realized that the Europeans have a prohibitory approach on GM food crops. The Americans have a permissive approach. And India, the land of Buddha, should always adopt the middle path. So neither permissive nor prohibitory, but precautionary. So my approach was precautionary. What did I say? I said, let's have a moratorium. Uh, The moratorium would get lifted subject to three conditions. One, there is a consensus in the scientific community on what type of test protocol for safety, for efficacy, for health effects, and so on. Number one, toxicity and so on. Number two, state governments are brought on board. And number three, we set up an independent regulatory, professional regulatory body, and not this internal GEAC type of mechanism. Scientists talking to amongst themselves. Now, and I expected that those three conditions would get fulfilled in a 5-year time span, but 11 years have passed by. Incidentally, I must tell you, the greatest supporters of my moratorium on BT brinjal has been the RSS and the Swadeshi Jagran Manch. They, they are the ones who were delighted, and they continue to be delighted by the fact that there was this moratorium. My moratorium was only on BT brinjal. It was not a moratorium. It was not a ban on genetic engineering or. And I said, look, transgenetics, this transgene, uh, is only one form of biotechnology. Now, of course, as you know, uh, this transgene is becoming a thing of the past. You have things like CRISPR and you have genetic editing and so on. A completely different game altogether. Genetic markers. So, in fact, I met, I mean, I have not mentioned it, in my speaking order because it was not right. But the Secretary, Department of Biotechnology at that time was a great scientist called Dr. M.K. Bhan. Maharaj Bhan unfortunately passed away a few months ago. And I asked Dr. Bhan, come and meet me and please educate me. And he spoke to me for almost 2 hours. At the end of it, he said, sir, what you have done is the right thing. I can't say it publicly, but you've done the right thing. I said, please, I will not utter a word on what you have told me because you're Secretary of Biotechnology. I want to respect your position. But this is what he told me. Dr. Swaminathan. In fact, Dr. Swaminathan's letter is reproduced in my speaking order. The reasons why we should be careful. And one of the reasons that he gives is, India is a center for genetic biodiversity, and you don't get into GM for crops in which you are the center for biodiversity.
Another initiative that you were recognized for was the Campa order, the Campa transfer of states, Campa money fund to the states. Right now we have 530 crores, 530 billion rupees in that in the fund, but there are always complaints about inadequate utilization or problems with FRA when things are. Why do you think it's happened? I mean, is it the design or is it the way it's implemented?
First of all, Mr. Warrior, I was against this whole idea of compensatory afforestation. And I said so to the Supreme Court. The idea that a monoculture plantation can give you the same ecological value as a multi-species natural forest is a bogus idea. We satisfy our conscience for the loss of forest cover, natural forest cover, by saying we'll have compensatory afforestation. I have never believed in this compensatory afforestation. I said so to the Supreme Court. But I was a voice in the wilderness. So as long as there was this whole idea of compensatory afforestation, net present value, and some forest areas had to be diverted for essential infrastructure. I suppose this idea of compensatory afforestation, and that's how this CAMPA, this whole compensatory afforestation management issue came up, and money got accumulated in the accounts. Money was not flowing back to the states. And it took me some time. I went to meet the Chief Justice, the late Justice Kapadia. I explained to him, and we were able to work out a solution, and the first funds started flowing. But I was very clear in my mind that the Gram Sabhas have to play a very important role. That it's not a free ride. It's not a free for all for the foresters. Unfortunately, in the way Parliament passed the Campa law in 2016 and the rules that got formulated thereafter left a lot to be desired. And many camper projects are being implemented to the detriment of local communities, where the local communities are not involved. They are not involved in the process. They're not involved in the choice, so on. So, but fundamentally, I'm opposed to this idea of compensatory afforestation. But if the Campa funds are inevitable and if they have to be used, I made it a point of saying that they must be used only for regeneration of natural forests. Because the survival rates in afforestation programs is very low. This has been our experience. It has also been our experience that when we have compensatory afforestation, we end up having acacia afforestation or prosopis or eucalyptus, whatever. It's not. These are not. We're losing forest cover. And in forest cover, we are not losing just the crown biomass. We are also losing the soil. Which is also a very important carbon sink. So ecologically, the two can never be equated. Unfortunately, we have equated the two, and I think we are paying a price for it. You know. Sooner we get out of the idea of compensatory afforestation, the better off we are, frankly.
I really enjoyed your second book on environment, the ecological history, I mean, ecological biography of Indira Gandhi. And actually, people like me who are students of, modern, try to understand modern environment history. We usually start our discussions from the Chipko movement and then build beyond that. But you moved the front date to mid 60s with that book. What sort of what motivated you to write that book?
Well, before the Chipko movement, the movement for protecting the Taj was very important. And that led, incidentally, to the air pollution control laws of 81. And before the Taj, there was the pollution in the river Ganga, chemical pollution in the river Ganga, just about the time that Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, became prime minister. It became a big issue in 67 and 68, particularly in Bihar. Well, I was long fascinated with Indira Gandhi. There are two images of Indira Gandhi in India. One is the Durga image. She is this all-powerful, the only man in her cabinet, the Durga, who took the vested interests on and liberated Bangladesh, for example, stood up to Nixon. There was the Durga image. The other image, of course, that she was the architect of the emergency, that she imposed draconian laws which completely destroyed civil liberties. She went against Nehru's very concept of party democracy, open democracy. So these are two images that we have of Indira Gandhi. But I found, and this is part of my reading of political history. Long before I became environment minister, I had been aware of the fact that she was extraordinarily sensitive to issues of nature. That Salim Ali, for example, had a great influence on her, since the early 50s. She got into environment through bird watching. Uh, Nehru himself was a great, naturalist. But when it came to the crunch, he would rather build a big dam rather than protect a national, forest area, which Indira Gandhi didn't. Indira was willing to put a halt to big dams. Nehru was not, although Nehru was very sensitive to environmental issues himself. And a large part of Indira's own sensitivity to nature and environment came from Nehru. But I don't think that was the predominant influence, because push comes to shove when the choice has to be made. Nehru was very clear. We need these big, large projects. So Indira, because of the Salim Ali influence, because of the influence Her spending a year at Shantiniketan, very important influence on her life and her thinking, Rabindranath Tagore. And her friendship circle, her uncle, her mother's brother, he was a botanist, one of India's leading botanists, a great, he was a herpetologist, yeah. Uh, K.N. Kaur, Kailashnath Kaur. He was a herpetologist and who kept pythons in his house as pets. And this is how Indira grew up. Indira probably spent more time with him than her father because her father was in and out of jail. And Indira also spent, I would say, a good part of her childhood and her youth in hill stations. Because her mother was a patient of tuberculosis, and she herself was a patient of pleurisy. So, she was Almora, Nainital, Mussoorie, Ranikhet, and finally Switzerland. So she was drawn to mountains, she was drawn to nature. And so she was a great environmentalist, great naturalist. And of course, in 1972, next year, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first UN conference on the environment,
Yes, and she was
where
the only other leader than Olaf Palme, no? I mean, she was the only
yeah,
leader.
where she was the only leader other than Olaf Palme who had to be there because he was the host, the only visiting head of government to speak at the first UN conference on the environment was Indira Gandhi. And see what happened in Paris in 2015. There were 90 prime ministers and presidents, more than 90. Whereas first time you had this conference in Stockholm, the only visiting prime minister you had was Indira Gandhi. And her speech, even today, is considered to be a milestone in global environmental discussions. I had some time, I had access to the Salim Ali papers, I had access to some other papers internationally. So I wrote this biography to bring out a dimension of a political personality. The preparations are going on for the war with Pakistan in 1971, and she is having meetings with Salim Ali, Billy Arjun Singh, Zafar Futeh Ali, and others on a Wildlife Protection Act. She was having meetings on how to protect India's wildlife when at the same time preparations were going on for the war with Pakistan, which happened in December of 71. And of course, all the big national conservation programs, the Project Lion, Project Tiger, Project Crocodile, the Project Ghadial. These were all conservation programs that had been started during her time. So, olive ridley turtles, the movement to protect the olive ridley turtles of the coast of Orissa, for example. India doesn't. There is no population of whales around India, but India became a member of the International Whaling Commission. You know, so Mrs. Gandhi was very concerned about, the whole issue of whales. The Japanese, the Japanese were quite unhappy with her for India becoming a member of the International Whaling Commission, because, as you know, Japan has always been against any form of control on the killing of whales. So she was a remarkable personality. She made it a political issue. As I mentioned, the Wildlife Protection Act, the Water Pollution Control Act, the Forest Conservation Act, and the Air Pollution Control Act. The four acts, the Central Pollution Control Board, and of course the Ministry of Environment. She set it up in November of 1980, and she was the first Minister for Environment. She was Minister of Environment till the day she was assassinated on the 31st of October 1984. So she walked the talk. I think she was, in a way, my role model when I was environment minister. In my view, she was India's first and India's last prime minister to walk the talk, you know. Every prime minister talks, but she is the only one who walked the talk, and she had the courage of her conviction. Silent Valley was a political leader. Karunakaran wanted the project. The CPM, Mr. Nayanar, wanted the project. The local MP who belonged to the Congress party, V.S. Vijayaraghavan, was a supporter of the project. But Mrs. Gandhi said no. On Tehri, for example, she took a very principled stand. She took a very principled stand on the Lalpur project in Gujarat. So she, politically, she was very, very, and she took a stand on wildlife issues, in knowing full well that some of her own political colleagues were running shikar companies. The Shukla brothers were running a tiger shikar company as late as 1970, 71. Tiger shooting is banned only after 1972. There is a moratorium in 1970, but it gets banned only in 1972.
I'll end with one with the last question on your position as the chair of the parliamentary committee. We are under pressure. India is under pressure on net zero and energy transition, fossil fuel to renewable energy. What is the practical position on that? I mean, political positions are one, rhetorical positions are another. But what do you think is the practical position on net zero and?
Well, net zero is really, in fact, in my view, is a misleading slogan. What does net zero mean? That you're putting in as much as you're taking out, and we do not have the technologies for taking out today physically. And India cannot phase out fossil fuels in the immediate future. India can phase down fossil fuels, but it cannot phase out. With today's energy storage technologies, we still need base load electricity generating capacity, and that will come either from coal or from nuclear. And both have their limitations. So, it's very easy to say that India will do this in the year 2050. You won't be there, I won't be there. Prime Minister will not be there. Nobody will be there. But we can say in 2050 we'll do this. All these G7 ministers, presidents and prime ministers, none of them will be there in 2050, but they're making commitments for 2050. So, we can feel good. We have also made a commitment. The Chinese have made a commitment for 2060. Xi Jinping is not going to be around in 2060. So we can also make a commitment. But I think, it's more responsible to say, what are we going to do by 2025? What are we going to do by 2030? I mean, 10 to 15-year roadmap is what we should be aiming at. And in my view, phase out of fossil fuels is simply infeasible. And in my view, undesirable also in the Indian context. It has to be a phase down. And it has to be an accelerated phase down, and we will still need coal. We will still need nuclear, barring, a major revolution in energy storage. The revolution that we have had in mobile telephony, which has completely transformed the telecom industry. Hopefully there'll be some new energy storage device. But there may well be sectors where we may be completely fossil fuel free. I mean, I can see a situation. I mean, I would welcome a situation where the government of India announces that after the year 2035, no petrol or diesel driven vehicles will be manufactured or used. I mean, if that's possible, you can have all electric vehicles by 2035. It's a 15-year time horizon. But you still need the electricity for the all electric vehicles. And that electricity cannot come only from solar, cannot come only from wind. It has to come from a basket of sources, which will include coal, which will include nuclear. In fact, I would argue that we need a much more aggressive nuclear program. Right now, nuclear capacity, nuclear supply, nuclear sources account for only about 3.5% of our electricity supply.
But the growth has been very slow, no, for
We have
decades.
been we have been saying that nuclear should account for at least 10%. But even if nuclear accounts for 5% or 6%, it will be a great achievement. But when I say something about nuclear, all the great environmentalists who are my great admirers begin criticizing me. Nuclear is, as I've often described, nuclear power is red rag to the green bull. If you're a green, you see red when you go nuclear. But I believe, from a carbon dioxide point of view, if you want net zero, you have to have investment in nuclear.
But it's been nuclear has sector has been growing very, very slowly, isn't it?
Very slowly. I mean, as I said, it's 3.5%. It's only about 3.5% of supply. And even if we reach 5% by the year 2035, that itself will be a stupendous achievement. And that's what we should be doing.
Last quick question: is there any other book on environment in the pipeline?
Not on the environment. I've just finished this book on the Buddha.
Yes, I got a Kindle edition because the physical one would take long time to come. So,
Yeah, so that was a completely different book. Right now, I'm thinking of writing a biography of something on to do with Indian science. Working on a biography of Obaid Siddiqui, who was the founder of, in many ways, the founder of molecular biology in India. He set up the TIFR Institute for molecular biology, then the NCBS, the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore. So I'm working something on science, but on environment, yeah, not yet.